Actually, I'll do it in French. Notre prochain channel intervenant va parler en anglais. Ce sera sous-titré en anglais et vous aurez la possibilité donc d'avoir la traduction si c'est nécessaire. Mais je vais introduire maintenant Kim Stanley Robinson qui sera là par un extrait préenregistré, qui est un auteur de science-fiction américaine qui a été très prolifique. Il a écrit plus de 22 romans avec une grande variété de travaux. Il est principalement connu pour avoir publié une trilogie à propos de Mars dans les années 90, qui a été extrêmement et qui continue d'être extrêmement influente, pour le meilleur et pour le pire d'ailleurs, comme il le dira. Mais il a également écrit récemment un film, enfin un livre qui vient de sortir en français, qui s'appelle Le ministère pour le futur, Ministry for the Future, qui a été sorti en anglais en 2019 et qui vient de sortir à présent en français, qui vraiment a permis d'aider à solidifier un champ qui est déjà existant, qui avait déjà commencé avec des auteurs, des autrices tels que Octavia Butler, qui est la cli-fi, la climate science fiction, la science-fiction du climatique. Et donc, à travers ce livre, en fait, The Ministry for the Future, le ministère du futur, il nous place en 2025, donc vraiment dans pas longtemps. Il avait eu 6 ans de prospective. En fait, un organisme qui est à Zurich, pas très loin du siège de l'autre fondation, LUMA. Et c'est en fait une institution qui a pour but de prendre en compte le poids des vies futures sur les décisions politiques du présent. Le livre commence sur des scènes assez tragiques, donc de vagues de chaleur en Inde qui tuent des millions de personnes. Et à partir de là, il y a cette nécessité de mettre en place une action politique qui soit plus équitable pour les générations à venir et éviter que cela reprenne. Évidemment, l'instauration de cette institution ne va pas changer la face du monde du jour au lendemain. Tout le livre va aller explorer toutes les difficultés à mettre en place ce changement. Et ce qui est particulièrement intéressant chez Kim Stanley Robinson, c'est qu'on est bel et bien dans de la science-fiction, mais cette fois-ci, rien ne repose sur un espèce de techno-solutionnisme improbable, même si ça a une place à l'intérieur de ses écrits. Il y a une vraie richesse dans on va dire, les descriptions politiques, sociales, économiques qu'il va explorer à travers son monde. Donc, je propose qu'on commence cette interview de Kim Stanley Robinson.
I appreciate that. And I think I tried to show that to make it a best case scenario that you could still believe in by making sure that the inertia and resistance to change are represented as happening. And I want to add this, though. I wrote that book in 2019 when the resistance was in charge in the United States. And the pandemic had not yet slapped us in the face with the news that the biosphere can kill you and change your life instantly. Well, that was a good notion on my part, but real history is going to go much faster. This is good news and bad news at the same time. The bad stuff is happening faster. The good responses are happening faster. So there's a sentence in my novel that says the 2030s were zombie years. That is not going to happen. I think it was 2016 to 2020 that were maybe the zombie years, or 2000 or 1990 to 2020 were the zombie years. And I wrote that in a moment of anger and maybe despair. But in reality, the 2020s are already bursting with change and with a sense that climate change has to be dealt with now. And there is still climate dread, there is still resistance. But the sensibility in the general culture that climate change is problem number one, that did not exist in 2019. And so we forget because the pandemic has kind of wiped our brains of how the structure of feeling felt previous to it. But we are in a new structure of feeling, and this is encouraging. The number of things that are happening fast are shocking to me, absolutely shocking. I'll add one last example. 30 by 30. This is at the biological COP at Montreal that the Chinese ran last year. That 30% of the surface of the earth should be protected for wild animals by the year 2030. Well, when I wrote Ministry, that was the most utopian aspect of the book, the wildlife corridors. And now it's actually a plan instituted. I couldn't be more surprised. And so it's good news. Yeah, happy to do so. And it's interesting. I like the distinctions that you made. These are two binaries, violence and legal action and carrot and the stick, because they're not the same. And that's good, because then you can do a grimace rectangle with them if you wanted to, and make some very interesting comparisons. You know, the grimace rectangle, you would put these two binaries across each other to make a quadrangle and then begin to do comparisons. I'm thinking, is there a violent carrot? Is there a legal stick? Well, there are legal sticks, but is there a violent carrot? Maybe not. Maybe violence. Now, but then you go to another binary, sabotage versus murder. And there you could say maybe sabotage is the carrot. I break these things, it helps everybody, and it encourages reinvestment in something cleaner. But to get to the heart of your question, what Malm taught me in his book was a clarity and a moral clarity between, and that there's a strong difference between violence against people, which is violence. And you're already making a good distinction. You don't use violence as a word against property. Breaking property isn't violence. That word should be saved for hurting other humans. You should never hurt any other humans. This is my own position. There should have been a chapter where somebody's saying, never hurt people. You only break things, and made that Malm distinction. And the novel should still have had the Children of Kali, should still have had Crash Day, and the scene where the assassin murders an oil executive in his bed. But the clarity is not there because I hadn't sorted it out the way Malm does in his book, that you can make such a strong moral distinction between these forms of physical resistance. And so many people are saying, well, what should we do? And I myself am just an individual. I have my own value system. I don't want to preach or even recommend things to people. But for me, that distinction, like, would you break something? Well, I've done that myself in my youth. But would you hurt someone else? No, I wouldn't do that. So this is the stuff that I think Ministry could have been clearer on than it is. This is being discussed more and more. So quickly, geoengineering is a name for a whole suite of activities that, as you say, they seem to use engineering means and be planet-wide or at least very extensive. There are many different proposals made, and each one needs to be evaluated on its own merits and dangers. And so it is a mistake to talk about geoengineering and solar radiation management or mitigation, SRM, the dust in the atmosphere method, as being the same thing. The solar radiation management method is the one that gets the most attention because it's the most extreme. It's global, it happens all at once. You can't really experiment before you do it in any meaningful way. And so it's taking up the discussion as if it's the only thing. And there are other maybe more interesting and yet equally effective practical ways of lowering temperatures, of slowing down ice loss, that also need to be discussed. But let's go back. We already have put aerosols into the atmosphere and also an enormous amount of carbon dioxide. We have geoengineered the Earth already in that very sense. And the aerosols we put in the atmosphere, there used to be a name, the Asian brown cloud, ABC. It was precisely India and South Asia that was under a blanket of its own carbon dust from burning fires and from coal plants. And it reduced the temperature there. recently, the International Maritime Organization has ordered container ships to use cleaner fuel. So their diesel fuel, bunker fuel, it's the dirtiest fuel out there that's liquid. They've had to clean that up. And suddenly the air has become cleaner. And that's probably one of the reasons why this year was the hottest year ever in human recording systems, is because we actually cleaned the atmosphere up a little bit by reducing the amount of coal fire burning from China and reducing the diesel fuel burning from ships. We have geoengineered by accident by cleaning things up. We've had a model, a sort of an experiment done by the Earth itself, and that we have very good records of what happened after Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines. And so we use that now as a model of what we could do artificially, perhaps with something cleaner than sulfur dioxide. Maybe it should be essentially limestone dust so that it didn't damage the ozone layer. The materials are being discussed of what we could cast up into the upper stratosphere. It would fall out, and then actually it hitting the ground, that's another problem. But on from the technical to the political, the governance issues are real, they're problematic, and they are being discussed. And nonprofits are trying to advocate that we build the governance method, that we get it discussed by the UN. There are government bodies that are international or nation state that are trying to think about how would we make this decision? And would it have to be a total consensus or a majority? These are all questions that at least are being discussed, but kind of cautiously and provisionally, and in a certain with a certain amount of fear that if we start discussing it, does that mean that we really want to do it, etc. Sure. I read about it in a paper online. A economist from Australia, Delton Chen, had proposed it in a couple of technical papers that Springer Verlong had published in online and maybe in print. To me, it solved a problem of how are we going to allow people to make a living by decarbonization. So if you think of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere, there's much more, billions of tons more CO2 in the atmosphere than is good for the biosphere. So we need to remove it. Removing it should be a job, a way to make a living. And maybe it's being like you build sewage treatment plants. It's like that. Government pays for it because no consumer wants to buy a sewage treatment plant. It's not a consumer item that people will go out and spend money on, but they want it. So government pays private industries to do it. That's the model here. So it's governments that need to invent a carbon coin where if you decarbonize in any way, shape, or form, from the individual to the city to the nation state, then you get compensated for it by fiat money, by which I mean not a cryptocurrency. I mean real money, like US dollars or the euro or the renminbi. Uh, and so this is a central bank device, and the central banks would have to be convinced that it's a form of quantitative easing, like in 2008, like in 2020. Trillions of dollars were made up and injected into the economy to keep the economy from crashing and people going hungry, to avoid a depression. Ministry for the Future is a nickname. The carbon coin is a nickname also for
Okay.
any financial instrument that happens to pay you that you can make a living or even make a profit by doing decarbonizing or biosphere health work. That's a kind of a carbon coin. And then the carrot is the carbon coin. If you were to decarbonize this planet in any way, you could make a living at it. And that's a labor intensive job. And anybody treating their soil right, any landowner could begin to earn carbon coin by treating their land differently and sucking carbon dioxide out of the air into their soil. Regenerative agriculture. I wrote the book in about 9 months, and I knew that I wanted lots of different genres mixed in. And I was using the word bricolage until I was in France last month, and suddenly I began to realize that bricolage is a name for do-it-yourself hardware stores. Maybe that's not wrong. But I was thinking, I guess, of collage, of modernist artworks where a whole bunch of junk is thrown together to make the artwork out of disparate parts. So it was a bricolage. Um, now, I wrote them whenever I was ready for them. So I would just go out into my front courtyard where I write. I would sit down with my laptop. I would look at a list of potential scenes that remained to be written. I would get a sense of which one I was ready for, and I would throw myself into it. And so I didn't worry about the ordering while I was writing. When I had all the scenes and I had a big list of them and they were more or less done, I began to try to think about chronology, like the 30 years that pass in that story. Can the scenes I write, could they make a coherent chronology? Not quite. If you were to try to date the 106 chapters, you would begin to see that it is truly a bricolage, even in the sense of time sequence. So then it was just a matter of feeling. One thing I noticed later, because I've had to reread this book in a way that I don't usually reread my books, anytime something good happens, the next chapter something bad happens. There's no euphoria of success. It's going to be a lot of defeats along with victories, and we are going to have to persist in trying to do our best through a series of reversals and defeats and catastrophes, and also wicked resistance from other humans. So I notice now the structure of the book is more emotional than chronological. It's trying to keep you on a feeling of struggle and chaos. And then in the last part, the very last maybe 5 or 8 chapters, I'm guessing here, a certain amount of calm. I don't know that it's not ecstasy or euphoria, although the Gaia chapter has a moment of body surfing that is the grace of the moment, of feeling like in your physical body you're okay and you're in tune with this planet. That's the religious moment, a moment of grace. But by and large, the at the end of the novel, things are not right, but they're calming down. And this is as far as I wanted to go in terms of the emotions of it. I wanted to make sure that when people were done, they could not dismiss it as, oh, Stan's such an optimistic guy, or, oh, people are not really like that. I wanted people to finish it thinking, well, people are really like that, and yet they came to a good place. Well, the simple answer is anybody. I have always wanted clarity, and I've always wanted not to be esoteric. And I come out of the science fiction tradition. And you have to understand that the science fiction community in the United States through most of my life was extremely esoteric. You had to know the history of Dune. You had to know the history of the Heinlein's future history. And outsiders coming to a science fiction text for the first time could bounce right off of it. The private vocabulary, the sense that there was a whole genre of genre conventions and rules and norms that they didn't recognize, didn't understand, and therefore this book meant very little to them. I always wanted to be transparent to any reader at all who loved novels. I'm an English major myself with a more substantial French background than I thought I had until I was in France last month, and I was realizing, um, you know, uh, Latour, Piketty, but also Montaigne, and there's a strong French tradition, especially for me coming through Jameson, Frederick Jameson. He's an expert on French theory, so everybody from Sartre and Camus up to Isabelle Stingers and Michel Serres. It's a fairly obvious escape fantasy. If only we could start over. This is the utopian impulse. History is such a mess. If only we could start over, we could make things right. Well, the problem is you can never start things over. And in my Mars trilogy, this is 1990, right after the end of the Cold War, and the 90s were strange, but they were filled of potential. And we didn't know that the surface of Mars is poisonous to humans, etc. So it was a thought experiment of, again, the utopia. You have a new place, you start things from scratch, you make a better system. It's a thought experiment. It's not a plan. It's a way of discussing. And even in the Mars trilogy, luckily, I don't have to defend that book too much because it's always coming back to Earth. It's always a reflection on the situation on Earth. And even in that book, they're saying, hey, we're terraforming Earth too. We might as well get good at it. So the Mars book was a book for its time. To take it as a plan now is escapist and wrong, and also a little silly. Thank you, Martin. It's been a pleasure, and I hope I meet you and all of your associates in person.
Voilà. Alors. Photo pour le montrer à Kim Stanley Robinson, tous ces gens qui l'applaudissent, il aurait adoré. Donc, on vous a montré cette petite interview, puisqu'on avait dit à Kim Stanley Robinson que ça durerait 20 minutes. Au final, on avait parlé 1h45. On s'est dit qu'on n'allait pas vous montrer ça. Par contre, vous pourrez voir en ligne la version légèrement éditée, où vous avez pendant à peu près 1h15 cet auteur extraordinaire qui déploie la suite de ses pensées. Et alors, comme petite note, je trouve que c'était très intéressant de voir finalement ce refus qu'il a de travailler sur ce qu'il appelle cette impulsion de l'utopie. Qu'est-ce qui se passerait si on recommençait tout depuis le début, cette espèce de utopian impulse. Je trouve que ça résonne de manière extrêmement intéressante avec la présentation de Michael, qui nous parle, lui, de ses contre-dystopies, et donc qui ne tombe pas dans le piège de la naïveté de l'utopie et essaie quand même d'imaginer des formes où l'agentivité des personnages permet d'imaginer d'autres formes de savoir-vivre. Je vais passer en anglais pour présenter notre prochaine intervenante. I'll now switch to English so that we have the pleasure of welcoming Shahzada Ahmed, who is a researcher in information studies. She's a chancellor